Now, according to one of the newspapers today, the Scottish Government is making contingency plans to maintain Scotland's membership of the EU if there's a Brexit vote. Is that true?
Well, I said in Parliament at First Minister's Questions on Thursday that I've asked the Scottish Government officials to look at all eventualities. I think it would be strange if, as First Minister, I wasn't doing that a few days away from a referendum.
No, but it's this idea that somehow or other Scotland could still remain a member of the EU.
Let me just say one thing very clearly, and then I'll go on to why I hope that every part of the UK votes to stay in the EU. But if Scotland votes to remain, as I hope it will, although I don't take it for granted, but we face the prospect of being taken out of the European Union against our will, then what I'll say today, I've said a million times before, I think we have to look at all options to protect Scotland's interests and to seek to give effect to what the Scottish people will democratically have voted
for.
I
understand the point about having another independence referendum. I just wondered whether there was anything that contingency plans might involve something else as well.
We'll look at all options. I mean, I think it will be very important, for example, that if we're in this scenario, and I hope we're not in this scenario, but if we're in this scenario, then Scotland's voice should be heard very directly in any discussions about what happens next. Now, what I would say, Gordon, is if we find ourselves in this scenario, which I hope we don't, but if we do, I'll come back here next Sunday if you invite me to, and go into this in as much detail as you want. But for the remaining days of this campaign, I think I'm entitled to focus my energies on seeking to persuade people in Scotland, obviously, but hope that I can help to persuade people across the UK to vote overwhelmingly.
But from what you've just said,
in the EU.
You clearly think there should be a role, if there is a Brexit, I know you don't want it,
of course,
that there should be a role for the Scottish Government in the negotiations afterwards with the European Union.
Of course, I mean, much of this, apart from any other arguments, much of what would arise as a result of that scenario impacts very directly on devolved responsibilities. Now, as First Minister, and I think it would be odd if as First Minister I said anything else, if we're in a scenario, and it's an if in both counts, of Scotland voting to remain and the rest of the UK voting to leave, then Scotland's interests must be protected. And my job as First Minister would be to make sure I was looking at all options to protect Scotland's interests and to make sure that the democratic will of the Scottish people was not simply ignored.
What if the British government says, sorry, you've misunderstood, this has got nothing to do with you?
Well, I don't think that would be acceptable. And, we'll see what unfolds after Thursday. But I repeat again, and, if we're in this situation, I'm sure we'll be having this discussion next weekend and for some time after that. But I hope we're not in this scenario. I hope people in Scotland vote to remain, and I hope people across the UK and in every part of the UK vote to remain for a variety of different reasons. Being in the EU means we're part of the world's biggest single market. I think that's good for jobs and trade and investment, good for our economy overall. But for me, there's actually a bigger and more fundamental aspect to this. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. I want to live in a world where independent countries, and I want Scotland in the future to be an independent country, but where independent countries choose to work together, where we're open and outward-looking, not closed and inward-looking.
The messages that your party is sending out on this referendum, I find terribly confusing, and I suspect I'm not alone.
I suspect you don't, Gordon, actually.
Well, I do, because on the one hand you're saying you want everyone, all your supporters, to vote to stay in the EU. On the other hand, you're holding out this prospect that if Scotland votes remain and the UK votes to leave, then there could be another independence referendum. Now, if I'm someone watching this, and I was a passionate yes campaigner, and the main thing I want is another European referendum, I'd be torn. Do I vote remain because it's important that Scotland votes remain, or do I think, well, Scotland's going to remain anyway, so I'll vote leave, because I desperately want the rest of Britain to vote leave.
If you're a passionate yes campaigner, and by definition therefore you're also very intelligent, in my view, that was a joke incidentally, but you see the complete illogicality of what you've just said there. Firstly, you can't assume that Scotland's going to vote to remain. That involves people coming out and casting their vote in that direction. But if you are basing your decision of how to vote on Thursday on what it means for independence, and let me be clear, I'm not basing my Remain vote on what it means for independence, but if you are, then the logic of that position is if Scotland votes to leave along with the rest of the UK, then the premise, that particular premise for a second independence referendum, doesn't arise. If we vote leave, then our immediate future is in the UK, outside of Europe, and perhaps at the mercy of a government led by the likes of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage.
The logic of what you're saying is that you would like Scotland to vote to remain in the European Union, but you would desperately like the rest of Britain to vote to leave.
No, you're twisting, and I think everybody watching this will hear you twisting my words here, Gordon. I want all of the UK to vote to remain. let me make this clear. I've done it to you in an interview before. Nobody watching this is under any illusions about my view about Scottish independence. I want Scotland to be an independent country. It's what I've campaigned for all of my adult life. But I don't actually want it to come about because the rest of the UK takes what I think would be a catastrophically damaging decision to vote to leave the EU. I want all of the UK to vote to remain. I'm simply pointing out that if, and I don't have control over this, if the rest of the UK votes to leave and Scotland votes to remain, then one of the consequences of that would be that we would have to have the right to look at a second independence referendum.
If I'm an independence supporter, I think brilliant. I hope that happens.
Well, but it is predicated in Scotland voting to remain. If Scotland votes to leave, this argument is a pretty moot point. It doesn't arise.
This is not an abstract issue.
I think most people out of listening to this will understand that, Gordon.
Well, I'm sorry if you think I'm twisting your words. It's not an abstract. I mean, one of my colleagues told me this morning she spent yesterday with two friends who are passionately pro-independence, and they're going to vote leave for precisely the reasons I outlined.
It's a great opportunity then for me to speak directly to these people and to anybody else out there who may think that that is the logical position to take, that's not. Because if enough people do that and Scotland votes to leave, then this particular premise for independence doesn't arise. So if you are basing your decision, and as I say, I'm not, but if you're basing your decision on what you think is best for the case for Scottish independence, then do not vote to leave. Vote to remain.
But even in the scenario you've been outlining, and you wrote about it this morning, if I was, again, a passionate independence campaigner, you say, oh, well, if Britain votes to leave the EU, we could be run by a right-wing Tory government. Well, nothing's more likely to increase support, surely, for independence in Scotland to the 60% that you want before you have another referendum. So, if I'm an independence supporter, surely if I vote leave, there's at least a chance I can get another stab at independence. If I vote remain, there's no chance whatsoever until at least the early 2020s.
Well, that's not true. We continue to build the case for independence on its own merits. But there's the logical flaw in what you're saying is, I've said if there's a leave vote across the UK, one of my big concerns is that we end up on a direction of political travel in the UK that is ever more to the right. Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, even more right-wing politicians than David Cameron and George Osborne. But if Scotland's voted leave as well, then rather than saying that we don't want to be part of that rightward drift in UK politics, we've kind of indicated that that's something we're comfortable with. So there is no logical case if you're a supporter of independence and a supporter of independent countries in the modern world coming together with that open, inclusive view of how the world operates these days. There's no logical basis in which to vote leave if that's how you're basing your decision.
Why is Jim Sillars wrong when he points out that, look, the EU and the countries within it hardly did your case very many favours during the referendum, so why on earth go and vote to stay in the EU?
But that would be like cutting your nose off to spite your face. Now, I've got huge respect for Jim Sillars. The first campaign I took part in was the Govan by-election in 1988 when Jim won. I've got huge respect for him. He was, of course, the original architect of the SNP's independence in Europe position. But I think on this he's wrong, and I say that with the utmost respect to him. I'm a passionate nationalist. I want Scotland to be independent, but I'm also an internationalist. We live in a world that is increasingly interdependent, where countries increasingly have to work together to tackle issues that no country can do alone. And I'd want an independent Scotland to stay in the EU, just as I want Scotland as part of the UK to stay in the EU.
That some of the rhetoric you've been writing about and saying about the possibilities of a right-wing Tory government and all the rest of it are scaremongering. He's got a point, hasn't he?
Well, I don't think he does, actually.
What you've just said about a right-wing Tory government, it's one possible scenario. Another scenario is the general election and Labour come to power. Neither you nor I know what's going to happen. We don't know any better than anyone else. That's why it's scaremongering.
No, I accept that none of us know for certain what's going to happen in the future. That is absolutely correct, and I can't argue that. But I think we all make our judgments. And, I think if we're looking at, and, I'm not the only one to say if there's a vote for leave across the UK, then there is a strong likelihood that David Cameron will not survive as Prime Minister, and there is a reasonable likelihood that somebody like Boris Johnson might replace him. I don't think I'm having to take some huge leap of imagination to put that across as a reasonable prospect. And I don't want to see Scotland be part of a UK governed by the likes of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. OK, we'll have to leave it there. Nicola Sturgeon, thanks very much. You invited yourself back next week to tell us what you make of the results. I would be delighted. Absolutely.
Thanks very much.